Okay. Okay, everybody, thank you for coming and welcome to this Saturday morning program of ASCE. This is the session on legal issues in Cuba's contemporary exodus. We have with us three lawyers. Well, in case anybody here doesn't know who I am Silvia Pedraza, chair and moderator. But I am so pleased that we have three very good immigration lawyers from this area of Miami. And so I will introduce each of them to begin with. Juliana Lamardo is a solo practitioner who opened the law offices of Juliana G. Lamardo, PA, in 2016. She was previously a senior associate attorney with a private law firm for over 6 years. She concentrates in the areas of deportation defense, family-based residency, and naturalization, and she earned her Juris Doctor from Barry University School of Law in Orlando and received a bachelor's in business administration from Florida International University in Miami. Ms. Lamardo has represented clients in removal proceedings before the Immigration Court and before the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services on family-based petitions, applications for residency, asylum applications, and applications for citizenship. Her dedication to clients is enhanced by the fact that she experienced the immigration process firsthand when officially she became a citizen of the United States in 2001. She immigrated from Brazil in 1987. She's fluent in Portuguese, Spanish, and English, and she understands the complexities associated with immigration procedures as she applies her knowledge and background to competently assist those who wish to build a life in this country. Willy Allen has been a practicing attorney since 1986. Prior to being an attorney from 1973 to 1985, he was involved in organizing, designing social service agencies, including Youth Co-op, Miami Mental Health Center, Little Havana Activities and Nutrition Center, Cuban National Planning Council, the Willy Chirino Foundation, and CODEC, a community development organization. He has also been a consultant during the Mariel boat lift in setting up camp and designing the services provided to the unaccompanied minor, as well as having and training projects for detained Mariel refugees at Detroit, Michigan, and New Orleans, Louisiana. Willy graduated from Florida State University with a BA in 1973, from Barry University with an MSW in 1977, and from the University of Miami JD in 1985. Willy Allen has served in the board of director of Youth Co-op, Cuban National Council, CODEC, and Peninsula Housing Corporation, and the Willy Chirino Foundation. He has also been an adjunct professor at the FIU School of Social Work. He has provided legal counsel to Human Rights in Cuba, the Foundation for Human Rights in Cuba, the Christian Democratic Party, and the Willy Chirino Foundation. Mr. Allen has provided witnesses and testimony at the United Nations Human Rights Commission in Geneva, Switzerland, as well as provided expert testimony in asylum proceedings in London, England. And so in the middle is Maria Isabel Marisa Casablanca. She is the chair of the Immigration Planning and Compliance Practice at Akerman, LLP. With 3 decades of experience in U.S. immigration and nationality law, Marisa represents corporate clients and individuals in obtaining immigration assistance and benefits. She is board certified in immigration and nationality law by the Florida Bar and was a member of the Florida Bar's Certification Committee for Immigration and Nationality Law. She has also served on the American Immigration Lawyers Association, AILA, National Liaison Committees with the U.S. CIS and the Department of State. Clients seek Marisa's reliable counsel on the full spectrum of immigration issues, including obtaining employment visas, investment and business-related visas, and residency for foreign nationals, representing family members of permanent residents and U.S. citizens, and assisting those seeking asylum. In addition, she advises employers on compliance procedures and represents employers before ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, with respect to audits. She also counsels individuals on how to maintain their status in the United States, and she assists them in planning their permanent residence. She also co-founded the Latin American chapter of the AILA. So we have a group of very well skilled and very wonderful immigration lawyers with whom to discuss these issues.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I am humbled and honored to sit beside Marisa and Willy. We're going to give you a little bit of a history of what the Cuban Adjustment is, how it's changed throughout the years, what kind of attacks has been on the Cuban Adjustment, how it affects our society today, how it's changed in the last couple of months alone, and how it's a little bit hard to keep up these days with all the changes that are going on. The Cuban Adjustment was enacted in 1966 because there was an influx of Cubans in the United States that were awaiting residency, and residency isn't something very easy to come by. It's actually very complex. There's different statutes where you have to specifically fit into, and the Cuban Adjustment opened up an area for Cubans to, thank you, sir, to be able to obtain residency in the United States. It was enacted by President Lyndon B. Johnson in November 2nd, 1966. And at that time, the law said that if you were Cuban and you were here in the United States for over 2 years, you can file for your residency. Throughout the years, that law changed a little bit because it was a very long waiting period for people to wait in the United States. So it was changed to state that if you are a Cuban national and you've been here physically present for a year and a day, you could obtain your residence. Now, there's a difference between being in the United States and arriving in the United States, which we'll get into a little bit coming up. If you were admitted, basically if you came in lawfully through an airport with a visa and you got here, you can obtain the Cuban Adjustment. You would wait a year and a day and apply through what we now call USCIS, which is United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, formerly INS, which a lot of people still refer to as INS. You would make your application, you would prove that you're Cuban, you would prove that you had the year and a day, and residency status, okay? That was only if you were physically present already in the United States. In 1994, there was a huge boat that came in with tons of Cubans, and they were intercepted at sea. President Clinton at the time gave orders, which we now call the Wet Foot, Dry Foot Act. There was a memo that was in place in 1996 that said if you made it to dry land, you could be paroled. And that's where the difference becomes, admitted or paroled into the United States. The Wet Foot, Dry Foot Act basically said if a Cuban touches dry land, they're paroled into the United States under humanitarian reasons. The law is 212D5, and those folks can also obtain residency after a year a day. That parole also gives people the opportunity to obtain benefits such as food stamps and welfare. Welfare? Willy?
No, Medicaid. What happens
Medicaid.
is, just to interrupt a second, what happened was in the 1980s, with the Mariel boat lift, the Cuban Adjustment Act did not apply to them. So they were brought in. But subsequent to the 1986 Cuban-Haitian Act that allowed Mariels and Haitians that came in with them to adjust, they had an issue as to who could receive financial assistance. So Dante Facel and Claude Pepper, who were brilliant congressmen, created a program where people who came in under parole, and that happened in the 1980s, could receive some type of assistance, including monetary assistance for a period of time, food stamps, and Medicaid. And then that became institutionalized. And in Florida, we still get a chunk of money from the Office of Refugee Resettlements and from HHS that goes to the Department of Children and Family Services to provide these funds, in particular, for individuals who come under parole, and that's mostly Cubans. Sorry.
No, and something to also bring in at this point. So if you're a Cuban national and you enter with a tourist visa, because I've had clients that come in with a tourist visa from Spain, and then they come to me and they say, look, I want the benefits. What can I do to get off my tourist visa and become paroled? Because if you come in with a tourist visa, you do not get any of those benefits, even if you're Cuban. You have to be paroled into the United States.
Right. That's why, that's part of the Pepper Facel Act that allowed them, anybody who came in with parole, to get assistance. By the way, for the last 10 years, I have consistently tried to push our congressman to eliminate that, but that's just me.
Yeah, it costs the U.S. government billions of dollars to provide that assistance, according to some reports.
Yeah.
Yes, and it's very, some people take advantage because although they can work and although they're capable of doing a lot more, and part of the reason Cuban Adjustment was enacted was to bring in these people that were willing to work and ready to work. And in later years, obviously not in the 60s, not in the 70s, not in the 80s, but more so now, they were just coming in, getting benefits, working under the table, and taking this money back to Cuba. So that becomes a little conflicting with obviously other countries of nationality that don't have that benefit.
And if you look at the congressional hearings when they were passing this act, you'll see that there was a lot of discussion on it's only temporary. These Cubans will go back because Castro's going to be gone in a couple of years, and that's how this was put forward. You know, this is temporary. These Cubans don't want to stay. That was 1966, and look where we are now.
Yeah, if I can just put in, I may be one of the few people here who was here in 1966. And I was already in high school.
I was 7 years old.
But unfortunately, I was already in high school, in the first integrated high school here when they integrated Coral Gables. But look, a couple of things. Number one, the Cuban Adjustment Act wasn't just created by my favorite president, LBJ, out of the blue. In 1956, those of us who are old will remember there was a revolt in Hungary. And literally thousands of Hungarians made it to refugee camps in Austria. And what happened was, we then set up a way for the Hungarians to come in. And for 56 or 59, I don't remember exact dates, there was a Hungarian Adjustment Act. And that's how Hungarians who came in at that time were able to get legalized. Something similar also happened after the fall of Vietnam. And some of the same camps that were later used for Cubans in Mariel were used for the folks from Vietnam, and they were also adjusted in a similar kind of act. What happened with the Cuban Adjustment Act and why we still have it from 1966 till today is that Cuba and the United States has lived in an immigration crisis for almost 50 years. The Cuban Adjustment Act, when they came into, when it was enacted, there was 240,000 Cubans living in Miami out of status. Before that, if you wanted to get a residence, like for example, my mother and my uncles, they had to travel, they traveled to Toronto. And they went to the American Embassy in Toronto, became residents in '62, came back to the United States as resident. So the idea of the Cuban Adjustment Act was to eliminate the need for these folks to travel to a post, be it Toronto, the Bahamas, or Mexico to obtain their residency. And the idea was to adjust them and move on. But what happened? Camarioca happened. And sometimes we forget Camarioca. But Camarioca happened in a crisis. So what happened with Camarioca and the folks bringing Cubans out through boats at that time was that we established the freedom flights. And the freedom flights were on from the late 60s till 1973. So the freedom flights twice a day were bringing Cubans in. So the Cuban Adjustment Act was expanded, continued to accept the Cubans coming in the freedom flights. Freedom flights are finished. We think now we'll legalize these folks and we'll move on. Then we have Mariel. And a bunch of Cubans came in that time too, and some Haitians. They didn't get adjusted under the Cuban Adjustment Act, but the Cuban Adjustment Act continued to exist. Then in 1995, we had another immigration crisis, the raptor crisis. And at that time, we moved all the folks who were at sea, we moved them to Guantanamo and to Panama. So when we started bringing them in, we had to find a way to legalize them. The Cuban Adjustment Act continued. And then as a result of the accords signed by, or agreed to by Clinton and Castro in 1996, we established a visa lottery for Cuba, where 20,000 visas will be granted to Cuba to bring people in and avoid another immigration crisis. And that's how the Cuban Adjustment Act continues to live. Sorry, ladies.
No.
That's okay.
I'll go back to my little corner.
No, very good information, Lily. Very good information.
In 2016, prior to Obama leaving office, he, in essence, repealed the wet foot, dry foot. And what happens is now we're left with, how do Cubans adjust their status if they get here and they haven't been admitted, they haven't been stamped in? And there's an entire process called credible fear. So if a Cuban now arrives and they are not under any kind of visa, which a lot of Cubans, at least in my experience lately, a lot of Cubans are traveling to Spain, to Italy, and they're obtaining citizenship there. And those countries are exempt from visa categories in the United States. So they'll come in, as Marisa says, they'll come in with a tourist visa. We refer to as ESTA, or visa waiver. They can come in. Now, those people have the admission. They can still benefit from the Cuban adjustment. However, if somebody comes here through Mexico, which is probably the easiest way to explain it, they have to go through a credible fear process, which is basically an asylum hearing with an asylum officer, and until they don't pass that credible fear, they won't be paroled. And we're still having issues, and I'm sure Willy has stories of his own clients that if the person doesn't pass credible fear, they won't be paroled. And then they're treated just like everybody else, that they'll have an order of removal from the United States. And it's an expedited order, so it gets a little bit more complicated because it bypasses our court systems. And that, we can get into a little bit more, but I did want to add that it's not just for somebody who is born in Cuba. So if you're the wife or if you're the minor child of a Cuban national, you still benefit from the Cuban Adjustment Act. And I'll get into a little bit of Matter of Vasquez that you guys can chime in. Matter of Vasquez was a case where it was appealed to the higher court on whether or not a person who is not born in Cuba but born to Cuban parents can adjust in the United States through the Cuban adjustment. And for a while, you could, as long as you were registered as a Cuban national and you had to prove that your dad was Cuban, and USCIS, our immigration system, would adjust that person. I think it was in November of 2017 that they modified that. USCIS says now only if you're registered. Is it the public ministry, Willy?
It's in United brings out a good point. Not everybody that gets legalized under the Cuban Adjustment Act was born in Cuba. Back in 1999, I think I might have had the first one, because I used to represent the Christian Democrats. I still work with them once in a while, and they were based in Venezuela, and there was a very large Cuban community there. So what happened was, some of the Cubans who were living there had children in Venezuela, and some of the ones who wanted to immigrate here, I had them registered at the Cuban embassy in Venezuela so they could get Cuban nationality. Just the same. My grandfather was born in Topeka, Kansas. My dad was born in Cienfuegos. When my dad was born, he was a U.S. citizen, because the Cuban Constitution, just like the United States Constitution and most other countries, permit the children of their nationals born in foreign countries to obtain that nationality. So clearly, most Cubans could obtain nationality. What they did was register at the consulate. And at the beginning, especially in countries like Venezuela and Mexico, Spain, have some from Brazil, they would be registered, and they would say, register Cuban dad, Venezuelan mom, and the Cuban birth certificate and records as observaciones. And in that area, observaciones, they would write in, so-and-so, through this document, is granted Cuban nationality. So that was used for a while to obtain nationality for Cubans born in third countries. The USCIS determined that they also need to have a passport. But to get a passport, you had to go to Cuba to get a passport, and people didn't want to do that. So there was an administrative fight, and it was a matter of Vasquez. Rodrigo Villar, who's a brilliant young attorney, and who always gives me briefs to use, was one of the guys who appealed that to the administrative units, and he won. They did not need to have a passport. So that was the way it was done till November. And what happens is, Cuba, and Santiago Alpizer, who's a great Cuban lawyer and American lawyer, and works with me and tells me what to do once in a while, the Cuban government itself changed the rules. And the Cuban government now has changed the rules as to how you obtain nationality. And why? Because the Cuban government, they're not idiots. They realize when you go in Budapest, or you go to Caracas, or you go, I have a guy from Zaire, to get their nationality at the embassy, it's not because they want to go live in Havana, it's because they want to live in Miami. So they've made it a little bit more expensive, a little bit more difficult to obtain nationality. So the Cuban government now says that that certificate of nationality has to be registered properly at the center in Havana, in la Plaza de la Revolución in Playa, where Santiago sends lawyers that we work with in Havana to go get them for us, and be registered there to be legalized. And the United States employs, and for the last 10, 12 years they've employed a Cuban lawyer to go check and make sure those are registered correctly, that they're not fraudulent documents produced and bought in Havana or Caracas. And so now they have one guy that goes and looks at it to make sure it's been registered. So if that's all good, we're still good to go. Sorry.
And they also sell them in Doral for some of my clients.
You know, there was that, when you were involved in that criminal case, I think Ben Rosen was the attorney that was prosecuting them, and you were at the AUSA involved. Yes, if you want to buy a Cuban nationality document, Doral has a little store. For the right amount of money, you too can become Cuban.
And that's where a lot of controversy arises out of the Cuban adjustment, because it made it so easy. You just had to present a Cuban birth certificate, and a lot of people that are not Cuban, that are not Cuban descendants, that are not the wife, the minor son and daughter of Cubans, they actually did obtain it. And a lot of the cases that come out of our courts now, and Ben Rosen did litigate a few of them, including some of my own, that the person presented themselves as Cuban to USCIS officials, and they did get granted residency, and they're not anywhere from near Cuba. So people have used the Cuban adjustment for purposes that obviously are not lawful, but I think, obviously speaking to these people, it arises out of desperation to be a resident or a citizen of this country. And yes, it is a privilege, and a lot of people were using that to abscond basically from, or not abscond, just bypass the system.
And it also permeates into other nationalities. For example, as Juliana mentioned, it includes the spouse or the children of a Cuban national. For example, a Cuban national will marry a Colombian woman. Well, that woman is now eligible for adjustment or residency because she is the spouse of a Cuban national. And her children too. So it would be the stepchildren of that Cuban national also would be eligible for residency, which every time there's something that's a little easier to get, it leads to abuse. And usually when there's a Cuban national married to someone from another nationality, directors of USCIS, one director, in fact, Maggie once told me, all of Maggie, all those cases are fraud because Cubans don't marry non-Cubans. And I go, I'm sorry, I have 2 Cubans in my family. I'm not Cuban, so Cubans do marry outside of Cuban nationals. So and she told me in Orlando it's Puerto Ricans committing that fraud, marrying other people, and in Miami it's Cubans committing that fraud. So it's always an interesting point.
Maggie became a born-again Christian. She's very religious, and I love Maggie.
Yeah.
She hasn't deported me yet. But look, every law has abuses and misuses. The Cuban Adjustment Act is just an act that was created for a short period of time that's become an animal. And a lot of times people ask me, well, how long is it going to last? For a long time. You know, they're smarter, they'll tell you how in 1996, IRA repealed the Cuban Adjustment. But Lincoln, who's also a very brilliant congressman, set up the Cuban Democracy Act. And the Cuban Adjustment Act was incorporated into the Cuban Democracy Act. So although the Cuban Adjustment Act was repealed by law in 1996, it remains in effect until the President of the United States addresses Congress and says, Cuba has had free, transparent, and democratic elections. The Cuban Adjustment Act is no longer needed. And Santiago, in his brilliant presentation in the next panel, will tell you about the program that they have to bring about free, transparent, and democratic elections in Cuba. But until Santiago's project takes place in Cuba, I don't imagine the American president is going to say that, unless maybe Ivanka meets with Mariela in Havana and they agree to build Trump Varadero. Then Trump Varadero may prove that Cuba just had free, democratic, and transparent elections. But until that happens, the Cuban Adjustment Act is going to be around for us to have. And more people use it correctly than abuse it. And sometimes we emphasize the abuse just because it's so interesting. But it exists. But it's minimal. The people who abuse the financial assistance is minimal. The people who abuse it in marriages or whatever, it's minimal. It's interesting in Miami because it's what we do. So we're going to deal with it more often. But it's minimal. And at the end of the day, it exists because the Cuban government exists in their form still today.
It's funny you bring up the whole, it is minimal because even there's a misperception between the judges in Miami and the USCIS officers that, as Marisa says, Cubans don't marry outside of their nationality, which is wrong because I'm married to a Cuban and both my sisters are as well. So I had a judge actually tell me years ago before I was, with my spouse, and she says, Brazilians don't marry Cubans. And I was like, I stayed quiet because, I was fairly new to her courtroom. And now I'm just waiting for her to say it again. So I say, well, Judge, let me present to you my own marriage certificate, and just have a little fun with that. But Marisa actually has quite interesting way of how the Cuban Adjustment Act can be taken away.
Yes, yeah. and Willy touched on that. In 1996, most of us immigration lawyers were blindsided by IRA, which is Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996. And that's what put in place all those sanctions. If you employ an illegal alien, a company can be fined. It can also, and that's what I do at Akerman a lot, is when there's mergers and acquisitions of companies, I do the due diligence. I go through the documents, the immigration documents in the Form I-9 of the company, and tell who's ever acquiring that company, they can be fined up to so many hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of dollars by bringing in that company because of all their I-9 violations. So IRA was something that just struck us, like, where did that come from? And part of IRA, as Willy touched on, there's a section 606, which I'm going to read to you. Conditional repeal of Cuban Adjustment Act in general. Public law, blah, blah, is repealed effective only upon a determination by the President under Section 203C3 of the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act, Libertad, Act of 1996, that a democratically elected government in Cuba is in power. Okay, so that's IRA. So when you go to the Libertad, it is Public Law 104-114. It's to seek, the title of that Libertad is to seek international sanctions against the Castro government in Cuba to plan for support of a transition government leading to a democratically elected government in Cuba and for other purposes. And specifically Section 203C3 of that act, excuse me, says implementation with respect to democratically elected government. The president shall, upon determining that a democratically elected government in Cuba is in power, submit that determination to the appropriate congressional committees and shall, subject to the availability of appropriations, commence delivery and distribution of assistance to such democratically elected government under the plan of 202B. And 202B is plan for assistance. What does the president have to do? Develop a plan for providing assistance and assist with a transition government when a democratically elected government is in power. So this is what Willy was referring to, how the Cuban Act continues to develop either, and that's the problem that we have with immigration law, is we don't just look at acts, we don't just look at regulations, there's also memos, like the Meissner memo, which when Janet Reno was Attorney General, where the wet foot, dry foot, that was a memo, and there's policies, and there's always an act, like when the Cuban Haitian Act, that was an act that included the Cubans and the Haitians because there was homeless Haitians coming in and Cubans also. And then NACARA, the Nicaraguan, Guatemalan, and the Soviet bloc countries, all those, that was NACARA. And if many of you were here in the 80s and the 90s, you remember that when the Sandinistas, in Nicaragua, the Sandinistas, were pretty bad. And a lot of Nicaraguans came and they applied for asylum, and the asylum units were backed up for 10 years. So what happened is immigration started going through the asylum cases and was going to start deporting all these Nicaraguan families that had children and everything here. So then there was a lot of demonstrations, and then NACARA came out and then included the Cubans too because they needed that residency also. So it's the future is gray because we don't know what's going to happen. Like I said, the act was enacted and the congressional hearing said this is a temporary thing. Castro will be down in 2 years and all these Cubans are going to go back. So, and that's the thing with the Cuban Adjustment Act is it's constantly evolving because we don't know what's going to happen anywhere, really. Over there and here. It depends. It's very politically charged, as many of you know. So we're not sure of the future, but democratically elected government, we'll see.
And it's challenged every single day in every single case. We certainly see it day to day. We see it with our own clients. We hear it from our colleagues, and most of you maybe know or not know, people are calling for ICE to be abolished. People are calling for, detention facilities to release everyone. And there's very strict procedures in place for Cubans. A Cuban can't be detained longer than 90 days. Most Cubans that are at Chrome, which is the facility that houses aliens, I'm not just going to say criminal aliens because there are non-criminals there also. They have procedures in place that when that 90-day comes up, they do a full review of the file. They have specific officers that review those files. And if they have no reason to hold them there, they do get released. And they get released into a program called order supervision, which has created a bigger mess for Cubans. And every Cuban that's out there that hasn't adjusted their status through the Cuban Adjustment or through any other means of adjusting, they have to report. And some of the conditions are inhumane. You'll see it all over the news. They're trying to better them, but as we go there often, it's not a pleasant thing to see, even for anybody to see.
It's not a pleasant place to go.
It's not a pleasant place to go.
Juliana and Marisa point out the future, and the future is interesting. The elimination of the wet foot, dry foot policy also created an agreement between Cuba and the United States where Cuba is going to accept people, deportees, a lot quicker. And Juliana was talking about Cubans who lose credible fear. And people lose credible fear. And those Cubans are deported back to Cuba right away. Cuba has started to accept people on a monthly, regular basis. Could be 30 to 40 people, could be less, could be more. Most of the folks who have lost their asylum cases in detention, and people lose asylum cases in detention from Cuba, they've already been deported back to Cuba. In a few cases, Cuba has not accepted them because the agreement between Cuba and the United States with Obama was that Cubans who were out of Cuba for less than 2 years, they will be accepted back immediately. But what has happened is some of the Cubans who have crossed the border and sought asylum have been out of Cuba longer than 2 years. They were living in Ecuador, Brazil, Uruguay, Colombia, and they came in being out of Cuba for more than 2 years. So the few Cubans who've lost asylum that were detained, that have been released on an order of supervision, are those few that Cuba has not accepted who are non-criminal aliens. There are between 30 and 40,000 Cubans who have committed crimes in the United States and have been ordered removed by an immigration judge. And they report annually to supervision because Cuba has not accepted them. The United States has made every effort for them to go back, but Cuba has not taken them back. As part of the agreement with wet foot, dry foot, Cuba has also increased the number of folks that they take back from that list. And they have concentrated primarily on Mariel folks. In 1986, Cuba and the United States entered into an agreement where they would take back some 3,000 people who were on a list. Obviously, most of the people on that list have died, been taken back, or are unable to travel anymore. But because that agreement exists, the United States and Cuba have agreed that that list is an animal that's alive, that can get new life on a constant basis. And that's what Juliana was talking about. If you're a Mariel guy and you report to Miramar now, you run a risk to be detained. And they can detain you up to 180 days to see if Cuba will take you back. If Cuba has not taken you back in 180 days, then you get released again in OSUP. Cuba is taking people back. I think Wilfredo Cancio was a great writer for TV and Radio Martí and also for Café Fuerte, had an article that he published in June where the DHS agrees that Cuba, from October 2017 till June or May 2018, Cuba had taken back 271 people. That's probably a very low number when you think about it, but between Cuba and the United States, that is probably the highest consistent number they've taken back since I can remember. So there are constant agreements, there's constant situations. The agreements between Cuba and the United States allow the repatriation, the deportation of Cubans now at a higher number. And that would have an effect as to what happens in the border. Detention policies, and Juliana mentioned detention. It used to be you were Cuban, you came in, you say, hi, I'm Cuban. Most of the time you didn't have a credible fear interview. You were processed and paroled out. Now, still, when you consider Guatemalans, Hondurans, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, Cubans still get paroled out at a higher number. But not all Cubans get paroled out. You have some detention centers, BTC here in Broward, Pines in Louisiana, York, Pennsylvania, where they have room enough to keep people there. And even though you pass credible fear interview, you may well have to do trials in custody. Before I got hurt in October or November, I had done trials in Batavia, New York, Pearsall, Texas, Laredo, Texas, BTC, on Cubans who were seeking asylum. One of you lost a couple. They got deported back to Cuba. And so the world has changed as to the easy way that you can come illegally. Cuba was granted 20,000 visas under parole in 1996 with the accord signed between Clinton and Castro at that time. And between 1996 and 2017, 20,000 Cubans come in annually under that program. They come in under parole. And then a year and a day later, they adjust status under the Cuban Adjustment Act. But that program was frozen in September because of the acoustic attack at the American Embassy in Havana. So this year, from October 2017 to today, July 27th, 28th, 0 paroles have been granted out of those 20,000 people, which is family reunification. So that may well have an impact down the road in immigration from the United States, from Cuba to the United States. And it's part of the policies that you have to look at in the future.
I think it's, sorry, go ahead.
And just to touch on what Willy said about those individuals who report every year, I know a few of those. And if you lived here in the 80s in Miami, I mean, even the cops were doing drug crimes. It was terrible. But many of them committed a crime in the 80s, one crime. They've been here all these years. And I just hope that if we repeal anything, something will be done for those individuals who've been here more than 20-some years, and it'd be really sad to deport them with all their family. They have jobs, they usually have businesses that employ other people, and just because of something that happened in the 80s, they're going to be removed. So that's one thing I hope that if there is some kind of repeal or they start removing, that they also have some kind of relief. And something interesting that's come up, the Supreme Court ruled on a case called Pedraza, was it last month?
June 23rd.
June 23rd. And Pedraza basically says that if you were, when someone gets placed in immigration proceedings, it's just like filing a lawsuit. The government files what's called a notice to appear. So the Supreme Court held that notices to appear that did not have the date and time on it were not valid. So a lot of people are filing motions to reopen those cases. So some of these individuals who have outstanding orders, I would look into, I don't have any of those clients, I would look into to maybe invalidate that NTA that was done back in the 80s and therefore reopen their case. And now they've been here more than 10 years, and they can apply for something called cancellation removal. They can have other benefits. But this is what I mean about immigration law. You have to be on top of everything, on top of the Supreme Court, on top of memos, policies, regulations. In fact, if you do immigration law, I think you have to focus on one part. You can't do everything nowadays because there's so much happening.
There is a lot happening, and what happens with these memos is that it's a human that's reading it, and we read things differently than one another. And it's interesting that Willy says, the memo says you can't parole after this date, you can't parole before this date. What happens on the day that the memo comes out? And that's where, that's where, the gray area begins, and that's where we come in and we start fighting. There is a family of 5 that came in. It was mom, dad, 2 kids, and grandma. So basically, and this was out of Texas, mom, kids, and grandma got granted paroles because they came in on the day the memo came out. Dad and one of the kids didn't, because the different facilities read it different ways. So there's still room for, even, this memo came out November of 2017 is?
No.
The repeal of wet foot, dry foot, 16?
March 2017.
So even on that day, we're still arguing it a year and a half later for these families that are detained. And, detention can be very difficult, not only for us, but for the person that's detained, for the families that are involved. So I think that anywhere that you're looking at, whether it's a law, whether it's, a statute, whether it's a memo, at the end of the day, we're still dealing with people. And it's people's lives that we deal with every day. And sometimes it's hard for me as a practitioner, as a litigator, to talk to an officer who just reads something and has this full discretion to say, well, that's not how I read it, and I'm not going to grant your client parole. And you're sitting there going, but his wife, same situation, got it at a different center. So that's, where we start fighting with them, and sometimes fighting with these officers, it's like talking to this wall. They don't understand. And these are the same officers that are out in Miramar for these orders of supervisions, and they say, well, your client committed an offense in 1981, and I'm going to take him in. And you're going, are you kidding me? Like, you're talking about almost 40 years ago, something that happened that in Miami was quite common to be happening, and they're holding on to that one little thing against that one person. There is a carve in the Cuban Adjustment that didn't make way for the Mariels. And a lot of practitioners are trying to use that today, in 2018, something that happened in the 80s, to fit in their clients. And as long as your client is not a drug trafficker or a terrorist, the judges can actually grant them residency. But put yourself in their positions. They've been here since the 70s, and it's 2018. They have nothing to show for it other than come here, work, create businesses, have a family. Some of them, one of my own, doesn't even speak Spanish that well. And it's hard because, at the end of the day, if they don't fit into that small little carve, you kind of have to turn around and say, sorry, you might get deported one of these days. And before, Cubans, they didn't think that could happen, and now we see that it's happening more often. And it's a sad reality that we're living, but hopefully somebody will have some sense and just kind of make everybody equal and everybody somehow fit into this. And it's hard to fit everybody into a box, but a lot of them have been here so long that they don't know what to do if they go back to Cuba. And I know that I have some, and Willy has some clients, and Marisa may have some clients that go back. And what do you go back to? And
They have a team in Cuba that goes to visit people's family. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you that I have a guy with a GPS right now. They went to his sister's house in Cuba. And if they have room, he's going back. The realities are, most of these folks did not get deported in the 80s, which, I don't know about you guys, I missed the 80s. My partners and I had a great time. I didn't do immigration work in the 80s. I did criminal defense work. I really missed the 80s and the fun that I had sometimes. We had fun. But at the same time, realities are that most of the folks that I represented were drug traffickers or pretty bad guys. They have turned the table, but the only reason they're here is because their country wouldn't take it back. China, Vietnam, Cuba, and Palestinians born in Israel with Jordanian passports are the people who usually do not get taken back because there's not a country for them to go back. I have some Armenians who were also criminals who were born in the Soviet Union, and they came in with Soviet passports, and Armenia won't take them back. So there's a few interesting countries that don't take people back. But part of the agreement now is that Cuba started to take back. And unfortunately, they're going to take back, and they've already taken back, people like the folks that Juliana has described to you. It's part of the reality of immigration, and immigration is really, like the Cuban Adjustment Act, is an animal that grows. It shrinks, it grows, it expands, it lives. You can see what's happening now with the separation of families and detention at the border. You can see what happens with asylum. While most countries are granting Venezuelans some kind of status as they flee Venezuela, what we're doing here is expediting their asylum applications, denying them, sending them to court to deport Venezuelans. While we ask that Ecuador, Colombia, and Brazil help Venezuelans who reach their border. At the airport in Miami, we're denying entrance to more Venezuelans and canceling their passports or their visas and sending them back. Doing the same thing with many Cubans. While we haven't granted one parole of the $20,000 a year this year, we have denied renewal of the 5-year visas, mostly at the Mexican consulate, some in Guyana. So Cubans who are trying to renew their 5-year visas, they're finding it more difficult to renew. Cubans who are applying for new visas as tourists are finding it more difficult to obtain. So in reality, we're going through a period of time when immigration is going to be more difficult in the United States. And even people with a privilege, like we've had a privilege under the Cuban Adjustment Act, even that privilege has shrunk quite a bit. Juliana was talking about people with ESTAs. Well, what happens with a Spaniard who's Cuban, who gets detained 5 months short of their 1 year here? Mm-hmm. More likely than not, they're going to be deported back to Spain and will not be allowed to adjust with the Cuban Adjustment Act. So, although the Cuban Adjustment Act, the future looks bright for it, because I don't think it's going to be eliminated. Who qualifies, how you qualify, and immigration in general, we're entering a little bit of a dark age right now.
The strict interpretations, the White House is now interpreting everything strictly, very strictly. And I always say someone there is giving brilliant advice because everything is being done through the laws and being enforced, as I mentioned, strictly, as Willy mentioned. It used to be more lax. If you came in under ISTA, which you didn't need an immigrant, you didn't need a visa, a tourist visa if you came from Spain, from Europe, and you were Cuban, you know, they wouldn't really, I said, I'm not going to waste my time taking this person in because they're going to in a year, they're going to get a green card. Same thing if they went to someone's house and they saw that they were married to a U.S. citizen, they said, I'm not going to take that person in. You know, they have kids, they're married to a U.S. citizen, they're going to end up with a green card. Why am I going to waste my time bringing them in, and then they're going to get a green card anyway? Well, those days have stopped. Right now, everything is being interpreted very strictly at the borders, at the consulates, at the, well, as I mentioned, the Customs and Border Protection at the consulate, USCIS, ICE also is interpreting everything very strictly. And when I started practicing, if there was somebody coming in Customs and Border Protection and they may have had something that happened at the consulate or something, they would call the U.S. attorney and say, do you want to prosecute this person for visa fraud or something? And this is like 25 years ago. They'd say, no, you know what, we're not going to waste our time with immigration. We don't care about immigration. Now they care about immigration. The U.S. attorney does, the SEC does. When you see all that EB-5 stuff going on, they're being very strict, and they're actually crossing their T's and dotting their I's.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry. I think that it's interesting that both Marisa and Willy have pointed out that everything is being strictly done. A Cuban who goes to Spain, who goes to Italy, obtains that citizenship, can come in visa waiver. That visa waiver, as I said before, they can stamp you in, you come in, you wait your year and a day, you get your residency. What's happening in our borders, both on land and on sea, through the airports, they're stopping and they're checking every single ESTA entrant, every single visa waiver entrant. And whether you're Cuban, whether you're Venezuelan, they will stop you and they're like, are you coming in here to seek asylum? And they say no. Are you coming in here to seek asylum? No. Are you coming in here just to get the Cuban adjustment? No. Even if you're answering no to all these questions, they're taking you aside, they're putting you into what we call secondary inspection, and they're basically pressuring so many people into saying yes, that they're taking those people straight from the airport or from the seaport and taking them into detention. And what happens is, the minute you say, yes, I'll seek asylum, they revoke your visa, they revoke your entry into the United States, they put you in what's called expedited removal. You just got an order of removal just by saying, yeah, I fear returning to my country. Even if that's not your real intention to come here. Maybe you're just coming in for a tourist. Maybe you're just coming in, you know, to see your family and leave. They have just created a system where, by intimidation, in my opinion, intimidation from what I've been seeing,
I'm being recorded.
it's okay. And they stop you. And it's basically, they're stopping you, they're taking you into detention, they're revoking your visa, they're revoking your admission, and then they're cutting off people's ability to use the Cuban adjustment or to use any other means of being here legally. These people are not coming in illegally. Willy mentioned that, yes, you can come in visa waiver, you've been here for 5 months, you only have a few months left to get the Cuban adjustment, you get stopped, you get taken in. They just revoked your entry into the United States at that point by issuing you what Marisa said, the notice to appear. The notice to appear revokes that, and then you don't have a way to get the benefit. You don't have a way to adjust your status in the United States.
And even with ISTA, you don't have to put them in proceedings, remember?
That was my next point.
Yeah.
If you're coming in visa waiver, when you sign that paperwork, you're signing saying that I don't need to see an immigration judge. And that becomes a problem also because then you just gave away your rights. And your only right at that point is to seek asylum. And
how did you obtain those rights in the first place?
It's an agreement between countries that they waive the visa process. It's called ESTA. You go in, you fill out the application. Most people don't know that by clicking agree or by signing agree, that there's a part there that says, I waive any rights to see an immigration judge in the United States. So in a way, it's an easier process to come in, but due process gets lost because you waived your own right to due process. And then you're in front of a judge for asylum-only proceedings. They say yes, you stay. They say no, you go. And you go to the country that gave you the ESTA.
Right. If you allow me to interrupt, what I want is to open it up to the audience because, believe it or not, we have a lot of people here who know a lot about immigration. And one of them is Wilfredo Cancio, who's sitting in the back, has been a wonderful periodista, newspaperman for a very long time. And another one.
He had the article that I used, right?
Yeah, yeah, the same guy. There's only one Cancio. I wrote it down. I have to read that article. And there's also Todd Anderson, who works at the U.S. Embassy in Havana, who is here with us, and other people who have less formal knowledge, but nonetheless. So if you would like to ask questions, make comments, that please do.
All of a sudden, you guys got really
That's what always happens in the classroom, whenever you say, okay, here, Aurelio.
I'm not an economist, so I'll preface that I don't have expertise, but as a citizen, it seems to me that in the macro view of immigration, those of us that are just in other professions looking at what you guys do, it seems that our immigration system is highly politicized. And so obviously it appears to me almost like a pot, and depending on what's happening, we open the pot a little bit and let folks come in and come out depending on how aggressive we want to be with respect to the country with whom we're dealing. And so immigration by necessity is fluid. And so obviously in the current Trump era, where our position is an aggressive enforcement position. With Obama it was more lax, but nonetheless it's highly political. So as immigration lawyers, what is your perception of what is the best approach for policymakers to have at the level below politics, at one level below where things actually begin to occur in a state that really does change? Because if it's Iran, we have a view. If it's Cuba, we had a view, and now we have a different view. And after 50 years of communism, Cuba's thing by necessity doesn't appear as threatening. So it's all kind of very almost news-driven. How do you guys think the people in ICE and the people that operate these systems as bureaucrats, how can they do their work more efficiently to be effective politically?
My heart goes out to all federal employees because they're subject to that political climate. And I know what was happening in the customs, what's happening in the southern border, where individuals were told, we can't take any more asylees, you have to wait, and these families with children and all that, they would just cross the border illegally and then get arrested. So I sent an email to the director of CBP and said, my prayers and my heart go out to your employees, because you put in a difficult position. I think anybody who works, this is my opinion, for the federal government really has a good heart, and they want to do what's right, and they try to do what's right, and you know, sometimes they just have to follow policy. Well, they have to follow policy because that's their job, that's their boss. But we're subject to the political climate. It's always been like that, because remember that the Attorney General is in charge of, you know, all the regulations. So I don't know if you want to comment, Willy.
No, look, I look at immigration in 3 tiers. 1 tier, I strongly believe in a merit-based. Excuse me? Oh, okay. I believe in 3 tiers. 1 tier is business, merit-based, investment type of immigration, and we got to be pretty open to that type of immigration because it helps our economy expand and grow. We have a 2nd tier of immigration, which is family reunification, what this administration likes to call chain migration. But it's really family reunification that is pretty slow, but it's effective, and it should be maintained. And then we have the issue with refugees and asylum seekers. Reality of life, 90% of the folks who come to the border and seek asylum, also including Cubans, are not going to be able to prevail in an asylum trial. Lack of food, gang violence, crime, failed governments are not grounds for asylum in the United States or any other place in the world. But we do have to look at refugee crises. It's not just us here. It's Spain, Italy, Western Europe. They have a crisis. So you have to determine how many refugees can a country take. I mean, I follow my Pope, and I think that he's right in that you have to have a humanitarian way to look at it. But there's also so much room at the end. So that 3rd tier is where I think is the biggest difficulty. And you know, if you follow Christian values of we are all our brothers' keepers, there's got to be some way to assist. But I also believe that the United States government, as a government, has to demand more from countries like Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, even Mexico. We have to demand more from countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, as to what they are going to do, as to their burden with refugees. From Central America, we have to put more of an emphasis that these failed countries have to provide safety for the people in their country. They have to provide some kind of care to assure they can live there. And that may include us eliminating financial assistance to these countries who are failed states. We have to demand that our allies in the Middle East step up and take their fair share of refugees. There's not a lot of people being transferred to Saudi Arabia or Kuwait. You know, Jordan and Turkey are stuck with it. And that puts a bigger burden on Jordan and Turkey. So we got to look at some of the other states that are supposed to be our allies and put a little bit of emphasis on them. So a 3rd tier of immigration becomes a problem. It becomes a problem with sub-Saharan Africa, as to where people go from failed countries there. And so if we're going to be a world leader, we have to take a kind of a bigger role on the stage and demand that these governments that we give a ton of money to, if we're going to give them money, then they have to show that they can take care of the population. But that's just my limited view of it.
I'll add a little bit. It's extremely political. So with every administration, the way we practice changes. The way we look at cases change. And, you know, when Obama left, he pretty much deported more than what we're doing now, because he set in place guidelines for who he wanted deported first, then second, then third, and everybody would go by that November 2013 memo. Then our administration changed, so the memos go changing. We have the same laws, however, there's little discretion that is changing. There's memos that are coming into place, so it's hard to be in the position where you have to set the law for everybody, because even though we have, you know, in the United States, everybody should be treated equally, you can't, because you have to look at what Willy's saying. Other countries need to start taking responsibility for their own. I do agree with Marisa that these federal employees and the people that work for the government, they're frustrated just as much as we are, because what they may be doing on Monday may not be what they're doing on Wednesday. And if you change things on the dime, you have a period of growth, and you have a period of where you need to get accustomed to the new way of doing things. So to say that, you know, everything is bad or everything is good is not a good assessment. I think that there's just a lot of frustrated people when it comes to immigration on both ends, on the practitioner level, on the litigator level, and, you know, on the judges level, and on the prosecutors. Everybody's just frustrated. And, you know, to be doing this, and I've been doing it less time than both of them, and I talk to prosecutors, I talk to the ICE agents, and at this point I can honestly just come here and say everybody's just confused and stressed and frustrated because of the ongoing changes. So it's hard. It's really hard to be that person to say, here's the rule.
Go ahead,
Thank
please.
you. I have a question first.
Do you think you could speak in the microphone so we can all be sure to hear you?
My first question is, what is the future of the U.S. Embassy in Cuba? And second, you mentioned that 10% are successful in seeking asylum. Can you give us some examples of what constitutes success?
Okay, well, he can tell you about the,
Yeah, I think Todd should answer the
he
question.
can tell you about the American Embassy in Havana.
Yeah, we need the microphone.
Just pass it around.
Yeah. No, you know, the embassy is still open. We're operating with reduced staff. We still have a consular section, but we're unable to offer regular visa services under current conditions. Not until we can address the health and safety concerns of our personnel.
And no plans to restart the 20,000 paroles?
Well, I defer you to DHS on that question, but their position is that program is under review, as are all parole programs.
Yeah.
You know, the second question that you asked about asylum, very tough to win. Last month I won asylum for a young man from Honduras who has had a kind of a lifetime of constant attack, persecution, unable to maintain his job. And once he also got identified by the gangs as being gay, everything from being molested to have his life threatened. And so he was well documented. He was able to explain his story well, and we were able to prevail. But at the same time, I had another judge on a woman who I thought should have prevailed, who was raped, attacked by a gang over a decade. Her daughter, who was 14, was a product of the rape by the gang. And now that her daughter was 14, the pattern was being repeated. But the judge determined that the rape, the attacks, the threats on her daughter were not sufficiently, were not part of a particular social group that merited her protection. So she was denied asylum from Cuba, and he works in Cuba. The people who are dissidents, the people who participate in activities where they can be discriminated or persecuted, I would say is relatively small. One of the cases that I lost at the border was an individual who had his own store, and he also drove a taxi. But along the way, they took away his license to work as a taxi. They didn't let him operate his store anymore. Was it politically? Was it commercial? One of the judges at the border found that he was not enough to rise to a level of persecution because he was directed by the government itself. What he was suffering was economic changes in the country and not particular persecution because of a particular social group as a cuentapropista or a self-employed individual. But at the same border, I had a doctor who had done a mission in Ecuador, a mission in Venezuela, then went to work in, I don't remember right now if it was in Guyana or another country, independently as a doctor, who defected after the doctor's program had ended where they could defect. And he crossed over the border. He had been a member of the Communist Party, had tried to do things right in Cuba, but he had been denied return to Cuba. He had married a Venezuelan lady. His life became miserable when he was in Cuba, which is why I went to Guyana. And the judge did find that as a doctor who had done missions abroad, who had defected and come to the United States, that he was probably in a position as a particular social group as a defecting doctor who had complied missions out of the country to be granted political asylum. And so a lot of it is, and Juliana does a lot of it, is how your client is able to express himself. Not all my clients are like my girl from Tajikistan who was Muslim, came to the United States, went to Key West, dyed her hair purple, and became gay. That was a 45-minute win. I wish all my cases were like that, but not every case is like that because she qualified as a particular social group. It was just, I prayed for cases like that. But some of the people Santiago and I have represented who were part of dissident groups inside of Cuba. I have a young man at BTC now who was here last year, went to the Congress, gave testimony as to what was going on in Cuba, was granted some funds from here, went back to Cuba. The embassy closed, couldn't get a visa to come here, got his body kicked and beat up, and he got scared that they would kill him because at the end of the day, they were accusing him of getting funds from the United States to create problems in Cuba. Well, he left through Mexico, and he's being detained at BTC right now without parole. I have his asylum hearing in 3 weeks. I think it's a very good case. I hope I prevail. But in a case in Virginia, where one of Silvia's friends, Juan Antonio Blanco, was the expert witness, the judge determined, yeah, he had been persecuted in the past. But Cuba had a new president and a new government. And he thought that the new president and the new government of Cuba were not the ones who persecuted him in the past. So he got denied asylum based on a new president in Cuba. Juan Antonio is having a rocket up his head, and he's contacted people at the State Department, he's contacted people in Congress going like, how could this be? How could this judge determine that? Well, that's what that judge determined. I wasn't there, but at the embassy, people who seek a refugee and asylum, not all of them get granted. I think he can tell you that it gets a little bit difficult to be granted refugee status or asylum status or refugee status at the embassy in the past. And it's a difficult road to hoe. And they talk to people there, not everybody there that goes, who have been at a protest or who helped out La Jama de Blanco, can really show persecution in Cuba.
I tell people asylums are 70% preparation, 30% luck. You can have the perfect case in BTC and go in front of this one judge there and will deny it. Who granted?
Who, by the way, both granted asylum to me and both got appealed by DHS after I got granted asylum. And both appeals got dismissed.
Oh, good.
But there's still, it's not paradise there.
No. It's so it depends on the judge again, as any litigation. It always depends on that. And also, something also happened because of course, we're always following things that are going on. there were certain decisions. So the way asylum works usually is you file it administratively with a local USCIS office. If it's not approved there, then it goes to the immigration judge, and the immigration judge doesn't approve it. You appeal it to the BIA, then you can appeal it to petition for review. You can go all the way to the Supreme Court. So what happened, there were certain decisions in the BIA, the Board of Immigration Appeals, that actually deferred or granted asylum status to private actions. Okay, private actions means gang violence, the situation that Willy was talking about. Private action is domestic violence in those countries because these women will call the police will call the husband, and the husband beats up the woman again. So those kind of things are private actions. So what Attorney General Jeff Sessions did is he certified, which I never knew that could happen, that's what I mean, everything is being done legally and brilliant. He certified to himself this decision, and so now private actions such as gang violence, domestic violence are not social group. As Willy mentioned, or Juliana mentioned, you have to fall into one of the asylum categories, which is, one of them is social membership. Oh, she wrote them down. Okay. So religion, race, nationality, particular social group, political opinion, torture, or torture under Convention Act. So the falling under a social group were the ones like the domestic violence and victims of gang violence. And I volunteered in 2015 1 week in Artesia, New Mexico, and one in 2016 in Dilley, Texas, to assist with AILA, with American Immigration Lawyers Association. A couple of attorneys went down there to help the women and children who were coming over on the surge. And it was interesting because every single story was worse than the story before. I mean, what's going on over there is just absolute, just horrible, horrible things, what they do. When you have to pull your daughter out of school at 14, or else she's going to become the girlfriend of the gangs, or your son cannot go to school because the only ones going to school are the gang members, and if they don't join, then they get killed. There's a lot of stuff going on. Tortures, putting guns to your 5-year-old daughter so you sell drugs. I mean, a lot going on. So that's why it was part of a social membership. But now, with this recertification to the Attorney General, now these private actions are not considered sufficient enough for asylums.
So
The question I have on that is, why do those private actions, which to a regular citizen like myself, basically, those sound like all law enforcement issues in another country. So why do we as the United States become responsible for law enforcement issues in another country and bring that into our immigration system?
That's a very good point. And it started off with Colombians when judges and reporters were being killed and tortured, and judges who were against the drug cartels, they were being killed. So that social membership, I think, basically, or before that, maybe with the Sandinistas. So what happened, it has evolved. Because it used to be if you were a police officer or you were in covert operations in Colombia and you were helping put all these drug traffickers in jail, then you would be granted asylum because you were a member of that social group of police officers who get killed because the government doesn't protect you. So part of getting asylum is that you're a member of that social group. You have an immutable characteristic. You're known as the police guy who's arrested all these guys, and wait, yes, exactly. But you have to have an immutable characteristic, and the government is not able to protect you. So that's where the social membership comes in. You want to explain the social membership?
I'm going to get into a little bit of what asylum is. And you bring up a very good point, which is what Willy was saying, that if countries take care of their own, we don't have to deal with the crisis here. In order to not deal with the crisis here, they've created our asylum laws, and our asylum laws are very specific. You have to have either been persecuted in the past or have a well-founded fear of persecution. Now, your persecution has to be tied, a nexus between these 5 different things, which is religion, race, nationality, political opinion, and a particular social group. Now, religion, you're either one, the other, or none. Your race is your race. Your nationality is your nationality. You can change it, but it's a little bit difficult.
That would be like Yugoslavia. You had the Croatians, the Serbs, and the Bosnians.
Political opinion, you're either for the government or against the government. Particular social group is the biggest one, because then we as practitioners, or as people's facts are brought to us, we start carving them out. And in carving them out, the Board of Immigration Appeals and the circuit courts have basically narrowed them. So in order to be in a particular social group, you have to have something distinct about you that you can't change. Being a homosexual.
Being a woman.
Being a woman. Mutilation. Genital mutilation. Those are things that you can't change about yourself. What was happening is, before Sessions certified all these things, we had already had certain groups of people be granted asylum. Women who are in abusive relationships that cannot leave that relationship because they're married or they're in family. Family membership is also a particular social group. I was born into it. I can't change who I'm born being sisters with. What happens is, these groups that are created, now we're starting to go backwards. Women who are in abusive relationships are now not social groups anymore, because the Attorney General has said that that's not sufficient. So if you fit into one of these categories and you can prove to an immigration judge or an asylum or a refugee officer that you have a well-founded fear of persecution, or you have future fear of persecution, to you, not to the whole world, that you should be granted asylum in the United States. We can get into technicalities that you have to file within the year of arrival. There's always exceptions to everything. But to answer her question and yours altogether, that 10% is really, really hard, because social groups are now being said they're not social groups anymore. Yesterday it was, today it isn't. Maybe tomorrow might be again, and it all depends on the facts, the presentation of your case, and how good your witness testifies. Now, when you go to court or when you go to CIS, most of our clients don't speak English, so you have to take an interpreter. Some of these people speak dialects that only they speak. And a lot of people that come to us have a second grade education level and can't express what their fears are. X, Y, Z. They can't do that. So it becomes difficult for us to present our case. You know, we look at them and we see that they've gone through these difficulties, but the judges have to mold you into this 1 of 5. So that's why the rate is low in asylum, because sometimes our clients can't articulate exactly what happened. And the most basic question that the prosecutor or the adjudicator will say is, well, can you relocate? Can you go somewhere else? Because that's part of our laws too. You have to fear everywhere in your country. It can't just be a city. It has to be all cities, all counties, all pueblos. So that's where asylum gets very, very narrow. And that's why Cubans don't get asylum as easily as it was before. So that's why there's the 10% and whoever your adjudicator is, because some of these judges, because of the memos and, you know, what we're going through now, they've been told that it's a very strict interpretation of these things. And if you don't fit perfectly in that group, you won't get it. Which becomes sad, because then you see, you know, Willy's client that's gone through all these horrible things in her life that can't stay here to be protected, which she should be protected from her own country, but we all have differences.
And asylum is persecution, what is it, by the government or a group that the government cannot control. So that's why it goes back to the Sandinistas, to the Colombian drug cartels and all that.
Hence, always goes back to politics.
Because if we keep taking, and we don't force the change, because in effect we're solving the problem. It's a tough call.
Exactly.
That's why
And
when you
that's
said
why-
the second one in command, it's so hard.
And
It's so hard.
politically, a lot of individuals from certain countries, well, those governments have asked the U.S. government to give TPS, because TPS, when it's here, it gives work permits to certain people, and they send the money back. They're all building their little house that they're going to retire in Nicaragua and Guatemala and all that, and that kind of stabilized for a while, and then, you know, it's all political.
Yeah, René Costales.
What is your current opinion at how the U.S. Department of State Human Rights Report is used by the immigration courts?
Well, they have to use it.
Yeah.
Because it's the number one report. I never just use the Department of State report. And some of them are pretty good, some of them are so-so for the countries. Some of them try to show there are positive changes in the country that can be used against you. But I don't only use the Department of State, although that's the one that the court can give the most weight to. I use human rights reports, Amnesty International reports. I try to find individual articles that deal with individual cases in each country and supplement the reports in that fashion. But the courts do give deference to the Department of State. And it does give deferences to changing circumstances in the Department of State. And I'll give you one example. One time, it was illegal to be homosexual in Cuba. Now you have Mariela Castro talking about having gay weddings in Cuba, and it's the Protestant churches of Cuba, supported by the Protestant Church of the United States, that is the biggest opposition to gay weddings. So where in the 1980s I would probably have a very good shot, and I won some asylum cases for Cuban gays, I would imagine that right now that road will be very, very difficult to prevail. And part of it will be based on the State Department country reports and changing conditions. So it plays a part. It is what it is. You can supplement it by other reports. And again, he can tell you the Department of State is going to give you a pretty decent report, but it's also going to be based on the interest of the United States. And at the end of the day, look, immigration in this country, immigration for any country, has to be based on the best interest for that particular country. And when you talked about criminal acts, I understand. I mean, to be kidnapped in Venezuela, to be subject to extortion for any work in Mexico, to live under gang violence in Honduras or El Salvador with a high level of murder for young children and for young people is horrendous. But that's crime. And for most immigration judges, crime, and under the American law, crime itself is a bridge too far when it comes to granting asylum. And that's why a lot of the action that's happening at the border now is pathetic, because it's separating families. But really, most of those folks, had they just been allowed to come in, allowed to present their cases, even in an expedited way, most are going to lose. The last caravan that came in, almost 90% of that caravan got deported back to their country without a lot of fanfare. They created a lot of fanfare now, and they created a crisis where the bottom line is most of these folks, unfortunately, are not going to be granted asylum. So now we created a crisis that did not need to be created.
I'm going to agree with Willy. Those reports, the judges stand by them. And if you want to win, you have to do a little bit more than just rely on those, because a lot of those they're not specific to your situation. So you do have to find other articles. You do have to ask, your clients to bring in articles from their own country and translate them into English so we can put it on the record. So that's just one of the things that we use because we have to, but a lot of it isn't good for our clients.
Of course, unless your client is mentioned in the country report, and I have had a couple of Cuban country reports. When a client was mentioned, I go like, thank you, God. Again, another one of those cases where I just sit back and I just thank God for my client being mentioned in a way that shows a group that he was involved with and stuff like that. But
You know, if I may add a little thing, I have a cousin who is a court interpreter with Spanish, of course, and he tells me that he sometimes, when he has a lot of sympathy for the case and understands that the person was under real duress and so on, in the process of translating, he tries to tell the person what sorts of things.
I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that.
We can
Don't tell us your
strike it from the record.
I don't want to hear that.
I think a lot of it also deals with the judges themselves.
Yeah.
Because they can get creative and they could use these 5 to their advantage. And Marisa and I co-counseled a case where, you know, the young man was technically outside the 1 year, but the judge formulated in such a way that, oh, look, here's the exception, and he filed it within the year. So the judges also can get creative in the way that they state their orders to the benefit of your client. Just the way that they can use the country reports to the benefit of your client. So it's a give and take.
And there's a lot of desensitizing. For example, when the first Colombian asylum started coming out in the 80s, a lot of immigration judges locally were granting them, and then they started denying them. So when they got to the BIA, the BIA started overturning and granting them, and then they stopped. So it's that desensitizing. Oh, another Colombian got killed. Big deal. You know, that kind of desensitizing according to nationality. I had a Venezuelan who his asylum had been denied, and I appealed it, and it was interesting because the persecution was that the Venezuelan government had appropriated all his millions, and I thought, oh gosh, you know, there's no torture, there's no this, it's never going to go. So I went to the Court of Appeals, and I won in Court of Appeals because up there, when they said, my God, you've worked, he was like 70 or something, you worked all your life, you got these millions, and the government took it away from you, asylum granted. So you never know. You just got to keep fighting and fighting and fighting until you win.
It's not over until the alien wins. That's our motto.
Yes.
It's not over until what?
Until the alien wins.
Oh, until the alien wins. Good.
Could you also address the special case of unaccompanied minors in front of the immigration court and the procedures they're using?
Unaccompanied minors is very interesting.
3 more hours.
3 hours.
We need 3 more hours for that one.
Basically, in just a little history, so what happened, it's prevalent in Central America, because I think that it didn't exist like with Colombian and the Nicaraguan claims, or the Eritrean or Somalians back then. It's usually children, usually orphaned, or their parents are here working like dogs, cleaning houses and sending money back for the grandmother to bring them up and everything, and they want to see their parents. So they come across without parents. They may come across with an older sister, so maybe the sister's 19 and the child is 17. You have to be under 18 to be an unaccompanied minor. And they get put in a different place. And so there was an agreement at the beginning, which explains the maratrucha and everything, because those were children we deported back then, is if you were, it used to be if a child was found illegally here, they would be placed in a detention center with other criminals, with underage criminals, juvenile delinquents, and they would be detained for as long as it took for hearings and all that. So there was something that came out, was a Flores Agreement. The Flores Agreement was any unaccompanied minors could only be detained, for 20 days max or something like that, and they could not be detained with criminals in a juvenile detention center or with adults. So that's basically, the UAC, unaccompanied minor, is a legal term for those group of children, and the Flores Agreement is what applies to them, which is what created the crisis in the border, because the government created unaccompanied minors because they took them away from the parents, so now they're unaccompanied, and they released the kids, and so it's, yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but.
There's also, court-wise, unaccompanied minors have special procedures. The judges don't have real jurisdiction over their asylum claims. So they have to go to the unit, USCIS, which happens to be next door. So the first jurisdiction for those asylums, for those children that don't have parents here or that came without their parents, is with USCIS. Now, USCIS makes a determination. Yes, asylum, no asylum. Yes, asylum, perfect. You close out the case in court. If they say no asylum, then they have to refer it back to the judge so the judge can do a second review of their asylum claim. What happens is, especially here in Miami, before we had about 14, 15 judges, and then, in the last year or so, we're now up to 20, 24.
Oh, good.
Yes,
No,
except
I'm glad.
except
I keep
six-
encouraging my students, but it's
No.
very.
except 6 of our judges
job.
only do UACs. And then I think about 5 judges only do detention that are not detained in Miami or Broward. So we're left with very little judges to do adult cases. So with the Flores agreement and things like that, we had the crisis, they specifically put judges to hear these cases, and what's happening is that the real people that we need to get out, that are the people that have committed, serious offenses and things like that, they're in limbo while we're dealing with children that are of no harm to the United States, yet we're dealing with those cases first because those were put on an emergency docket. And what's happening is ICE can't touch these kids until they're 18. So you have a 4-year-old sitting in court, and the judge, great, you go to the asylum office, that takes about, 6 to 8 months, then it comes back to the court, you delay it a little bit more. We're talking about a 2-year process for one child that ICE can't touch. So the UAC is a little bit of a problem because the judges can't take care of them, USCIS has to take care of them. USCIS has plenty of work to do with all the Venezuelans, all the Hondurans, every nationality that comes to the United States to seek asylum, and our backlog was up to 5 years. So
Do complement that with the dilemma of abandonment as a basis for.
the USCs, one of the reasons why they're allowed to stay is a special immigrant juvenile visa. But that's not granted at the immigration level. That's granted at the state court level.
Right.
So you have to put their immigration case on hold, go to a state judge, ask the judge to determine that one or both of that child's parents has either abandoned, abused, or neglected the child. And in that sense, you have to present documentation to the state court. The state court authorizes it. Yes, I found abuse from the mother or neglect from the father, one or both or either. And then you take that back to the judge, immigration judge. You file an I-360, which is a petition for a special immigrant juvenile visa. And then you close out the case in court. Now, those visas are on delay. So it's creating an atmosphere where we're getting a lot of no's and we're getting a lot of please hold. So that's where the UACs come into play with our immigration system.
And that's become fluid too, because the dependency hearings in the state court also have changed a little bit. I don't practice in state court, but first of all, you have to have it done before the child turns 18. And then there's certain orders that immigration would not accept because that order did not specifically say abused, abandoned, and neglected. So then that immigration attorney would have to go back to the attorney who does state and say, look, you need to go get another order from the judge because it needs to state this. So it's a complicated system.
Let me say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, just the standard
Right.
standard proof for abuse and neglect is different than for abandonment.
Correct.
Yes.
So abuse would be putting the child to work while they're 12. Making the child go pick up the corn and for you to have dinner on the table, and if they don't bring 6 corns, then you beat them. So that's abuse. Abandonment can be anywhere from the child's parents going to prison to, the father or the mother leaving the home, stopping them from eating, not providing for that child's well-being. So that could be neglect, that could even be imputed into abuse.
Yeah.
So there's different ways to categorize it, but in state court it's becoming a little bit more difficult as well, because somewhere down the line somebody says that immigrants were abusing that system, so it became a little bit more complicated at the state level as well.
I think we have time for only one question, and I want to call on Oilda del Castillo, and I want to mention that her brother, Ciro del Castillo, was very involved with processing the Marielitos when they landed in Miami in 1980.
Takes my breakfast every Saturday.
Unfortunately, Ciro has to go to the office this morning. He just started working after a long operation and so forth, so that's why he's not here, because I'm pretty sure he will have come to see Willy.
Him and I worked together during Mariel.
That's right.
Of course, he claims that I got paid while he worked.
But anyhow,
I can't deny that, by the way.
and as many as you know, I don't live here in Miami. I live outside Washington, D.C., in the residential areas outside Washington, D.C. now. But I have a question in general, and most of the what can I say? The wording in the radio, in television, in the news is about the Latin American or the people crossing the south border. Mm-hmm. But my God, I have seen enough immigrants from all over the world, around Washington, around the different states I visit occasionally, especially in the airports. Everybody in the airport is from Ethiopia or from other places, because I always ask, Ghana, Togo, etc. Is any relationship between the different immigration lawyers or any conference or something where you discuss the situation on those other areas?
Every day. Every day, it's either done through our association, which is the American Immigration Lawyers Association, or there is, and I'll let you explain what PINCUS is. There's different organizations, CABA, CASA, the Cuban American Bar Association, the Colombian American Bar Association.
There's even a Facebook thing about immigration lawyers helping each other out.
Yeah.
So in the practice in general, and I'm the oldest guy here, so I guess I've been doing it longer, we all help each other out. And 90% of the time, before I go do anything, I've discussed it with at least 2 or 3 other colleagues, bless you, to see what we should do. Also, I had to approach different cases. We share knowledge and information. And by the way, for all you to know, Oilda worked for the State Department for decades. She was probably the highest ranking Cuban ever to work in the State Department as a career person. And if you ever walk into an American embassy somewhere in the world, more likely than not, either she constructed it, directed it, created it, or was involved with it, except for the one in Russia with all the bugs.
I never went to Russia.
She didn't do that one. But
I didn't want to go to
every other embassy, one way or the other, she had her finger in it somewhere along the way. And the best part about her is that her brother buys me breakfast every Saturday.
We as immigration attorneys, it's a small group. A lot of people know each other, and all these groups, whether it's AILA, CABA, CASA, the pro bono organizations, there's a lot of information out there, and as of recent, there's a lot of camaraderie. There's a lot of people helping each other out, not only for the legal support, but also for a personal support, because sometimes we take on all these problems and we kind of just have to talk it out.
Yeah, I was going to make one last comment, since Willy mentioned that I work for the State Department. I work first for the United States Information Agency. But in my 50 so many years here in the United States, the only time I have felt discriminated was by a consul in Venezuela or Oslo that couldn't grant, even with my background working in the State Department, and telling him, I am a colleague of you, I am making responsible for these people. He's not going to stay in the United States, but he's traveling to Miami to get to Venezuela. I just want them to be here for a weekend so he can see his family. No way. He will not change his mind. And that was supposed to be a colleague to colleague, and I have all my letter of recommendation in my office, and he could trust me, and I was responsible. Couldn't get it. Many years ago.
Well, he can tell you. It's a rough road.
I think our time is up because there is another session that we'll be using this room. And I want to thank Juliana Lamardo, Marisa Casablanca, and Willy Allen, not only for being here with us today and giving us a very good presentation. I was even quiet all the time just so I could hear you, but also for your work, also for your efforts.
And felicitation for the panel, because it's the first panel where here have been an interchange of the three of you on the team.
Thank you.